It's Emily OFC Podfix. Flashpoint. Written by It's Emily OFC. Read by It's Emily OFC. Chapter 8. Kakashi tossed a risque calendar from 3 years ago onto the growing pile of items to throw out. He'd been excavating Jiraiya's office for nearly a week now, in between call-outs and training, and had barely made a dent. He wanted the office to be in decent shape for whomever eventually took over as captain, but there was more to it than just that. He hadn't been sent to Station 10 to clean the office. He was there to get the crew straightened out, get them set up for success with a new captain. Annual trainings weren't the only tasks Station 10 was delinquent on. A myriad of other items, most of which Tsunade would have to attend to for reasons of rank, needed to be identified and cataloged so that they could be worked on. Performance reviews, budget reconciling, grant requests, and just about every other administrative duty a captain was tasked with had fallen by the wayside at some point or another. Kakashi was beginning to wonder if Jiraiya had known he was going to retire and just stopped bothering with it, or if it had in fact been the mounting likelihood that his delinquency would be called out that had led to his sudden departure. Kakashi had no idea where the man was, and he'd gotten rid of his cell phone. He had claimed in a final text to Kakashi that he was going off the grid. Otherwise, Kakashi would have demanded an explanation for the state of his records. To say the least, Jiraiya's filing system left something to be desired. For one thing, documents didn't seem to be separated into different cabinets and drawers by date or document type, so much as they seemed to be organized by how damaged the document was. One drawer for stuff that the man had clearly never bothered to read through, another for files littered with coffee mug rings, an entire filing cabinet of documents that had been balled up completely but somehow not designated as trash. It was impossible to decipher any logic to it all. After 6 days, Kakashi was nearly at his wits' end. He'd made marginal progress at best, and when he looked around the office, it was more cluttered than when he'd found it. Jiraiya may have hated doing paperwork, but damn it, so did Kakashi. And now the man was who knows where, doing who knows what, and Kakashi was stuck here, cleaning up his mess. Kakashi could feel his jaw tighten in annoyance as he set aside a stack of what appeared to be reimbursable expense receipts. Had they been submitted? Were they even from this year? Impossible to tell. To make room for the next pile of documents to sort through. As he pulled a manila folder off the top of the stack on his right, letting it drop into the center of the desk, a small, wallet-sized photo slipped out. Kakashi's father's face was staring back up at him. Sakamu Hatake was young in the photo. Younger than Kakashi was now, even. He was wearing his full formal uniform and smiling as he shook Jiraiya's hand while they posed for the photo. It was his induction photo. He was fresh out of the academy, bright-eyed and whip-smart, assured by all of his superiors that he was going to be a shining star in the department, that he would one day lead it. All of them had been wrong. Kakashi's throat was tight. He was mad. Mad at Jiraiya for making him clean up his mess. Mad at Tsunade for forcing this assignment on him as a poorly concealed attempt to get him to reapply for lieutenant. Mad at his dad for being a hero instead of a leader. Mad at Obito for being exactly the fucking same. Mad at himself for doing nothing to stop history from repeating itself. Fingers stiff, Kakashi peeled the photo off the desk and shoved it roughly back into the folder, being sure not to let anything else fall out before depositing it in an open drawer which he then slammed shut. He turned around, away from the paperwork, and leaned against the desk, facing the bookshelf that lined the back wall of the office. He tried to slow his breathing. He tried to relax his jaw. He needed a break. His instinct was to grab for Makeout Paradise. The book was a little cheesy, maybe, and he'd read it about 1,000 times by now, but it was a comfort read for him. Unfortunately, he'd misplaced his well-worn copy sometime recently and for the life of him hadn't been able to locate it. He'd thought he might buy a new copy, but then his favorite bookstore had burned down, hadn't it? When had it happened, he wondered. When had everything gone to shit? The knock on the door at that moment might have been a rock thrown through a window for the way it startled Kakashi, physically shattering his thoughts and replacing the oxygen that surely had been sucked from the room seconds prior. He turned around and gathered himself for just a moment before calling out a response. "Come in," he said. The door creaked open slowly, and Tenzō's head appeared from behind. "Am I disturbing you?" he asked. Kakashi shook his head, gesturing for Tenzō to come fully into the room. "No, not at all," he answered. "I'm just trying to get things in order in here." He watched as Tenzō surveyed the clutter, eyes lingering on the inappropriate calendar Kakashi had discarded minutes prior. "It's a work in progress," Kakashi qualified. "Do you need help?" Tenzō asked. Kakashi sighed and ran a hand through his hair. It was damp. Had he really worked up a sweat just sorting through paperwork? "Thanks. But I don't really know what's just general files and what's confidential, so I think I'll have to do it myself," he said, wishing it weren't true. More hands made less work. "Ah," Tenzō acknowledged. "All right. Well, I was just checking to see if there was anything I could do to help." Tenzō turned to leave, but Kakashi wasn't ready for the interruption to be over. He desperately wanted to avoid the obligation to go back to sorting through the endless stacks of nonsense. "Wait," he said, and Tenzō righted himself to face him again with a questioning look. Kakashi hesitated. Tenzō looked uncomfortable. "Did you mean it when you said you don't care if the crew thinks you're a teacher's pet?" he asked, wincing internally as he did. This was a bad move, but if he couldn't escape into Makeout Paradise, he at least needed some time to be himself. Tenzō's eyebrows were raised now. "I did," he said. Kakashi looked over Tenzō's shoulder into the empty hallway behind the door. "Do you promise to keep whatever we talk about in this office to yourself?" he asked. Tenzō's eyebrows were now completely hidden by the hair that fell over his forehead. "Yes," he said confidently nonetheless. Kakashi waited a beat, just giving the man ample opportunity to take it back. When Tenzō simply stood waiting, he nodded once. "Close the door." As Tenzō obliged, Kakashi rounded the desk, moving a stack of books off of one of the chairs there. "Have a seat," he said, making his way back to the captain's chair. Kakashi collapsed into his seat as Tenzō settled back into his. He looked tiredly across the desk, letting his face do what it wanted and not trying to hide his exhaustion. "I hate this," he told Tenzō. Tenzō's brow furrowed. "I didn't want this job," Kakashi continued. Tenzō frowned. "Oh," he replied. "I'm sorry?" Kakashi sat up a bit. He wasn't expressing himself well. "No, it's not that I don't..." He stopped and started again. "It's just..." He gestured to the piles of paperwork on the desk and floor. "I mean this. I hate this. Records and training and filing and being the bad guy." "Oh," Tenzō said again, nodding his understanding this time. Kakashi was going to need him to be a little more loquacious. "I mean, I'm good at it," he said, "but I hate it." "Don't you have to do that stuff at your other station?" Tenzō asked him curiously. Kakashi considered explaining to Tenzō that he was not, in fact, a lieutenant at Station 15 and thus had virtually no leadership or administrative responsibilities, but that would require more opening up, and he thought he was already doing plenty of that as it was.
Station 15 runs itself, he answered truthfully. We've had a history of good leadership.
Tenzō considered this with a tilt of his head. Yeah, I guess with a captain like Captain Senju, things would be in order, he said finally. Kakashi felt a laugh bubble up in his throat, and it felt good to let it out, though it looked like it surprised Tenzō.
She can be scary, yes,
he agreed, watching as this admission of his seemed to cause Tenzō to relax a bit more.
But we've had a few good captains, and we've seen our fair share of loss, which always changes a crew's outlook on administrative tasks.
Kakashi had meant for this point to just be a passing comment, but he could see the way it impacted Tenzō, whose eyes were suddenly unfocused, as though he were somewhere very far away.
Speaking of,
Kakashi said, watching as Tenzō seemed to come back to himself.
How are you? Still doing okay?
Yes, Tenzō assured him. Yes, I'm good, and thank you again. Kakashi waved off the thanks. It was perhaps the millionth time Tenzō had thanked him since the hybrid car incident last week.
And Anko? Is she doing okay?
He asked. Anko? Tenzō asked, clearly not expecting to speak on her behalf. Kakashi smiled grimly.
She hasn't spoken a word to me since it happened. I guess I really pissed her off.
Tenzō sat back, crossing his right foot to his left knee. No, I don't think so, he said thoughtfully. Kakashi cocked his head to one side.
No?
He asked. She has been quiet lately, but I don't think she's angry. When Anko is angry about something, we all hear about it. Maybe she's not ready to accept your leadership style, but I think it's probably a step in the right direction that she's stopped vocally objecting to everything you say. Kakashi blinked at Tenzō. That actually made some sense.
Wow,
he said.
I didn't know you knew her so well.
I don't, Tenzō said with a shrug. It's just stuff you pick up on when you work with people. Their quirks, what makes them tick, what motivates them, stuff like that. Kakashi leaned forward, placing his elbows on the desk.
Not everyone can do that, actually.
Tenzō looked prepared to disagree, but Kakashi spoke again first.
This could actually be useful, he said.
He scooted his chair back and pulled open one of the desk drawers. It was the one he'd cleaned out first to have a place for his own things. He produced a small spiral notebook and a pen before pulling himself to the desk again.
Okay,
he said as he scribbled down a few notes on what Tenzō had just said.
That's Anko. Now tell me about Hayate.
What? Tenzō asked, planting both feet on the ground again. You want me to tell you about all of the crew members' personalities? Kakashi clicked the pen in his hand twice.
Well, you are my teacher's pet, right?
Tenzō blushed fiercely at that, and Kakashi had to raise his left hand and pretend to scratch his nose to hide his grin. That had been on purpose. After he'd seen Tenzō's reaction to the Cosmopolitan magazine incident, he hadn't been able to get the image out of his head. A flush of color suited Tenzō well, and he seemed to be fairly easy to fluster. It probably wasn't Kakashi's best trait, but he did enjoy engaging in a bit of teasing now and then. It might have been a bit irresponsible as acting lieutenant, but this was a temporary assignment. He'd be there for maybe another month at most. What did it hurt to have a little bit of fun with what was otherwise a terrible assignment? Right, so Hayate, Tenzō began, not quite meeting Kakashi's gaze. And that just leaves Kotetsu and Izumo. Not much to say there. They're probies. They listen to whoever's the loudest, which is usually Anko. Kakashi had filled more than 6 pages of his small notebook with Tenzō's help. The man was perceptive as hell, and all of it would be extremely useful to him as he worked to gain the crew's trust and respect so that he could get them ready for a new captain. In the time they'd been talking, it had grown dark outside. Kakashi realized that it had likely been more than an hour, with the way they'd veered off on tangents, each sharing stories of crewmates they'd worked with. He'd been unsurprised to learn that Tenzō's crew back in Denver had been a very straight-laced one. It explained why he was the only one who seemed to be relieved by the new circumstances. It had been a very informative conversation, but it had also been fun, relaxing, exactly the escape Kakashi had been looking for when Tenzō had shown up in the office. They know what they're doing for the most part, Tenzō continued, but they aren't always focused on the right things. How do you mean? Kakashi asked, clicking his pen open again. They're completely useless on a job if civilians are around, Tenzō said. They don't want to do any work. They just want to brag to anyone who will listen about what great firefighters they are. Kakashi smiled. They're woo-woos, he said. Huh? Tenzō asked, wrinkling his nose at the word. They don't say that out west? Kakashi asked. Woo-woos. Probies are volunteer people who are low on the totem pole but will brag to any civilian they meet about being a firefighter. You know, woo, look at me, I'm a firefighter. Tenzō laughed out loud at his description, and it made Kakashi smile wider. That's them, Tenzō agreed. Good to know, Kakashi said, making a note in his notebook. Wait, are you really writing that down? Tenzō asked, standing up from his seat and leaning over the desk to look at Kakashi's writing, laying his palms flat just in front of Kakashi's elbows. You can't write woo-woos in your notes. Kakashi bit his lip to hold in a laugh as he finished writing it, underlined it, and circled it for good measure. Tenzō lifted a hand to grab the pen to stop him, but both of them were halted as the door to the office opened suddenly without warning. Tenzō craned his neck to see, and Kakashi leaned to the side to see around him. It was Asuma. Hey, dinner's ready. Tenzō, you left your books on the table. Can you move them so we can get eating? He asked, though he was making eye contact with Kakashi. Kakashi was suddenly aware of how familiar he and Tenzō must look, crowded into each other's personal space as they hovered conspiratorially over a notebook full of scribbles. He dropped the pen and pressed his hands into the desk, pushing his chair backwards to create some distance. Oh, right, Tenzō said, straightening up. Sorry, I didn't realize it had gotten so late. I'll go move them. With that, he was out the door without a glance back. Kakashi rose to standing as well, intending to follow suit, but Asuma lifted a hand to stop him, blocking the doorway. You're going to want to mentally prepare yourself before you go in there, he said sternly. Kakashi quirked an eyebrow in question. You left your special book in the library. The crew found it. They've been reading it out loud in the rec room for the past hour. Asuma's serious expression gave way to a sinister grin as he spoke. God damn it, Kakashi groaned. It's Emily OFC Podfic.